Welcome back. In our previous episode, we introduced the MSX standard and its original conception. Now, let's see where in the world it was the most successful and where it completely failed to gain market shares. We'll also discuss the standard's evolution over years as compared to its rival machines. In Japan, South Korea, Argentina, and Brazil, the MSX was the preeminent home computer system of the 1980s. It was also fairly popular in continental Europe, especially in the Netherlands and Spain. Classrooms full of networked Yamaha MSX computers were used for teaching informatics in schools in the Soviet Union and some Arab countries. The MSX was number one in Brazil thanks to the local manufacturer Gradiente, which created systems that were heavily promoted in the country throughout the late 1980s. MSX-compatible machines were made by over 100 manufacturers, for many of which this was the first try at creating a personal computer and mining into the video games market. This was Sony's first experience with video games, in partnership with Microsoft decades before the two companies became the most important rivals in the home console world. However, the introduction of MSX in the US was slow, and Microsoft was not actively promoting it, which seems surprising. As we saw in our previous episode, the MSX was an initiative of Microsoft Japan, not US, but the standard was largely based on the American-made Spectra Video. And there was its paradox. Even though it was based off an American system and an American company's hardware design, the MSX was basically unknown in the United States. This was largely due to timing. In 1983, the U.S. computing market was well established and competitors were pushing an aggressive price war. It was eventually introduced at the CES Computer Show in 1985 by Yamaha and Pioneer. However, the presentation was not a success. The announced invasion of MSX machines was coming much too late when the U.S. market was already moving to 16-bit machines: Apple Mac, IBM, Atari ST, and Commodore Amiga. As for the 8-bit market, it was already dominated by the C64, who had gotten rid of most of its competitors by cutting prices. InfoWorld magazine predicted the MSX doesn't stand a chance in the US market, and that prediction proved correct. The easiest place to get an MSX in the US was a music store. Some of the Yamaha MSX computers could be found there among instruments and devices, making it one of the few MSX manufacturers with an American presence. In Europe, the first MSX computers were introduced in September of 1984. The first models available in Europe were produced by Sony, Toshiba, Canon, Sanyo, Yashica, and Philips. Unfortunately, supply was limited. About 100,000 machines were available for all of Europe during the first 6 months, thus limiting the overall sales numbers. The reception of the MSX was very disparate in the different European countries. Whereas sales were pretty good in Spain, France, or Italy, they were poor in the UK, where cheaper entry-level computers, like the ZX Spectrum, were already very popular. The popularity of the Philips brand in Belgium and the Netherlands helped boost the sales in those countries. Despite the different commercial situations by countries, in 1984, the overall prospect for the MSX still seemed rather bright, and the MSX standard was expected to solve the chaos created by incompatibility. Introduced in 1986, the MSX2 would suffer from the separation of ASCII and Microsoft. It wasn't a major evolution from the original. It still didn't become a 16-bit system, only its minimum RAM was increased from 8 to 64 KB, and video RAM was also increased from 16 to 64 KB, with most models equipped with 128 KB. While the sound processor remained the same, the main improvement was the graphic processor designed by Yamaha, which would have a display resolution of 512 by 212 in 16 colors or 256 by 212 in 256 colors. The MSX2 was fully backward compatible with the MSX1, which was a huge advantage, and the contrary would have been awkward for a machine whose aim was to impose a standard. Eventually, close to 10 million MSX units were sold worldwide, including 7 million in Japan alone. In comparison with rival 8-bit computers, the Commodore 64 is estimated to have sold 17 million units worldwide, the Apple II sold 6 million, and the same for the ZX Spectrum. The first Atari computers sold at least 4 million, The Amstrad CPC 3 million, and the Tandy TRS-80 sold 250,000 units. So the overall score of the MSX would have been extremely good if it was a single brand, but it looks rather pale if we consider it as a standard which combined about 100 different manufacturer companies. Was the MSX up to its expectations? It depends on the perspective you take. From a general one, it was not. The worldwide revolution didn't happen. But from a personal one, I can tell you that all the former MSX owners I know, and all those that I've read about, are positive. This was a unique and awesome experience. To have a computer that also allowed to play outstanding console-like games, only MSX machines could offer that. The MSX resembled a home video game system since it largely relied on cartridges at a time when most computers had already moved on to floppy disk. This contributed to the system's reputation as a computer that was really good at video games. And it was truly the case. Apart from scrolling, a feature that they obviously lacked, MSX games quality was remarkable, especially those from Konami. What do you think? Was the MSX a bad idea? Actually, it was a good one. Microsoft had realized, likely years before its competition, that a market full of incompatible computers was eventually going to become unsustainable. But every good idea needs some support, and Microsoft didn't support the MSX properly. It could have done much better in many countries. Had the MSX come a little earlier and benefited from stronger commercial efforts, the revolution could have happened. Because if you were lucky enough to have one in 1984, you would understand what I mean. The fan community is fairly strong, a proof that this computer no less loved than its most brilliant competitors back in the day. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you soon. And in the meantime, have nice retro dreams.